Hello viewer! So I gave this a bit of a clickbait title really because I don't actually think Gnon is really a Luddite, but I do have some disagreements with him on the matter of construction materials and techniques. So Gnon is a Twitter account. I think it's just a Twitter account. I haven't seen a website or anything of that sort, but on this Twitter account this man promotes traditionalism and particularly focused on architecture, traditional architecture, traditional materials and traditional styles and so on. I don't disagree with him terribly much on styles, but I do disagree with him on his rejection of materials. So I wrote a script for this, so I'll go ahead and give this a read. So, I'm not an architect, I'm not an interior designer, I've got no experience of those things. I have, however, experience of building things, remodeling things, houses, shops, all sorts of things. So I speak mainly from the experience of someone doing installation. So electrical wiring, plumbing, carpentry, that sort of thing. I'm a qualified welder, I'm a qualified electrician, and I'm an amateur carpenter. Meaning I've built some furniture and done some basic woodwork. It's not my specialty. So my main critique of Gnon is his absolute rejection of modern building materials. Because I generally agree with him on the style and the aesthetics, but it is not actually necessary, in my opinion, to abandon concrete and steel and drywall and carbon fiber and so on as building materials. In fact, I think it's counterproductive. For one thing, traditional building styles do not take into account the necessities of modern living. Installing wiring, light fixtures, plumbing, air conditioning, heating systems and so on is not possible using only stone and brick walls. In modern construction, what we do is we generally use concrete walls for the exterior supporting walls. And then on the inside we build a drywall system of gypsum. Usually we leave about 5 centimeters, 2 inches of space, and that's where we do all the installation of all the materials people need. Anything from your water lining to your electrical wiring to those components necessary for heating or air conditioning, depending, but that's basically the system. The other option is to pour all of that directly into the exterior concrete walls, which is sometimes done in bigger buildings, but that means you have a lot less modularity, and it's basically too hard to really change anything after that, so you revert to the gypsum system anyway. So while prettier than concrete, a fully brick or stone wall is expensive and does not allow pouring into it anything. You either need to use a double wall system, or you have to basically chip out everything and then cover it with something to keep the aesthetic look. So it's not well suited to modern installation. And also concrete remains cheaper than brick or stone, generally speaking. Now what we do in traditionally styled buildings here in the Netherlands, now for a while we used concrete, brutalist and Bauhaus styles like everyone else. That's kind of been falling out of favor lately. And we're returning to the traditional brick architecture in the Netherlands. But we're not going back to completely building everything with brick. What we're doing is we still use concrete for the structural walls and so on. And then we cover the outside with a sheet of bricks, which is pre-printed. You basically just get big sheets of bricks, single brick thick, rather than the at least 2 or 3 you need for actually supporting brick walls. You glue that on the outside and that's your system, and you can do a lot with that. It's a system that's still in its infancy, but if you have a computer system that can basically pre-assemble these things, you can get all kinds of patterns, and you can basically imitate the traditional brick style of the Netherlands using that, and it's still cheaper because you use less bricks, less man hours, and you use concrete for your supporting walls, so you've got all the modern techniques with the aesthetic looks of traditional brick. So it's a system that needs some work still, but that's sort of the synergy system that I'm looking towards, that I favor. Now, another reason to use modern materials like carbon fiber roof shingles or double-sided glass, to use drywall with insulated fiberglass insulation, for example, that's energy conservation. In warmer climates, this is less relevant, but in Northern Europe, this is quite important. You'll talk to a Dutchman, one of the topics you can always talk to a homeowner about is how well his home is insulated. Because these modern materials, they allow you to have better climate control. Concrete's less porous than brick, for example, leaks less energy, double-sided windows better than single, for example, so on and so on. Modern insulation is better than traditional insulation, mostly. So this means that energy loss, and that is also better for the environment, which, being an environmentalist, I consider quite important. It's also cheaper than using, well, it's generally cheaper because you've got less energy loss, and installation using these techniques is simply cheaper for the construction of the building. So I'll give you an example. Carbon fiber shingles are installed in sheets, just like these brick systems are, for example. They look just like traditional clay shingles, but they require a lot less man hours to install, and they don't suffer from things like weathering, wear and tear. So they have a longer lifespan, cheaper to install, better insulated, don't wear out so fast. So on that, for example, and it looks exactly the same as traditional clay shingling. So it looks exactly the same, but it's different material. But it's not always the case that modern materials are better than older ones. For example, in Southern Europe, where keeping cool is more important than conserving energy, obviously, because it's warmer there, modern materials haven't yet matched traditional building techniques. For example, what they do in Southern Europe is they use bricks that have hollow chambers in them, which allows air to be trapped in there. And this air will cool during the night, and then during the day it will make sure that heat doesn't enter the house, so the house stays cool through the system. And outside of using air conditioning, modern building techniques haven't actually improved on that. And I'm generally not saying we should not use traditional building techniques. I'm arguing for synergy and for efficiency, to be cost effective. So you use what works best. You use, if traditional building techniques work better, you use those. If modern techniques work better, you use those. You know, double-sided glass is better for insulating, for example. You don't want to use, what's the word for those? Glas in loodram, whatever. So I'll give you an example of a material that actually is modern, but it's not necessarily superior long-term to traditional materials, and that's concrete. The price of industrial sand, for example, has been going up substantially because of our overuse of concrete in all of our constructions worldwide. This also means logistical chains become increasingly complex and long, and as I've said many times, without hydrocarbons, without oil, long logistical chains become impossible. So sourcing sand locally would be difficult, which means you would return to materials that are more locally available. For example, in Northern Europe you would use brick again, in Italy you'd use stone again, and so on and so on. So sand shortage might be an issue. Another thing with concrete is that it doesn't have a very good long lifespan. It's well under a century that most concrete buildings last, and that before they have to be torn down. I think it's something to 50 to 60 years. Most concrete buildings have to be torn down and replaced, which is absolutely incomparable to traditional stone and brick buildings, or even wood buildings in some cases. Because concrete suffers a lot more from wear and tear, is a lot more susceptible to things like roots breaking it up and growth and so on. So it's a generally less quality material than stone and brick in that sense. It can sometimes be cheaper or better to use if you're building something for a period of about 50 years. But if you're building up anything for longer than that, you might want to just return to traditional materials and combine that with things like then just double walling it or using interior wall systems. However, it's not always necessarily the best option to just return to traditional materials. You can always try and innovate. For example, another option would be, rather than returning to brick and stone, we start using more steel, and we build buildings with a steel skeleton. We just sheet the skeleton in things like carbon fiber plating and, for example, such brick layers for the aesthetic on the outside, which would probably be still cheaper than actually using traditional building styles with brick, which require masons and so on, and a lot more material. Steel is easy to assemble. Steel is very structurally strong. So innovation is always an option, rather than having to return to tradition. But sometimes tradition is also an option. Now, on the matter of styles and urban planning, I don't really disagree with Brad Gnon. Architecture is our environment, and it has very deep psychological implications on our everyday lives. You can't argue that your surroundings don't affect the way you think. If you're locked in a completely blank room all day, that's going to drain you psychologically more than if you're locked in a museum, you know? So architecture is important. It's what shapes our living environment, for most of us living in urban environments, of course. So I agree with his idea that we should return to traditional styles, density, and so on, because traditions have been tested over the millennia, and as with values, these have been proven, basically. The idea that Gnon advocates for is generally to go for higher density and less urban sprawl, so less suburbs and more tightly packed cities, which yeah, as a European, you know, I agree with absolutely. This also has implications on the environment and on human psychology, because if you compare, for example, an American and a European city, well, you can't live without a car in an American city. And European cities are trending somewhat towards that, but you can pretty much reach where you have to be on foot most of the time, and public transportation is usually also a lot better. So, you know, going for higher density and less sprawl is good for the environment, because you use less cars, less travel distance. Less travel distance also means you've got more spare time, because you spend less time commuting all day, and you know, things being closer by, neighbors living closer by is and having a more of a sense of community is also a good thing for your general psychology. So again, that's certainly something where, at least in the planning parts, traditionalists in the architectural school absolutely win. But there are some issues with the absolutely traditional style, because if you go to a city like Prague, you'll notice that it's very, very difficult to get around with a car. Now, you might not object to that if you live there, but it is an issue, for example, for policing and ambulances. So having some big boulevards in the Parisian style is not necessarily a bad idea for, you know, public safety, healthcare, and so on. Anyway, so for those thoroughfares, you might not want to use asphalt. Asphalt's not an environmentally friendly material. It's also not a very pretty material. You might want to go back to using cobblestones. You don't necessarily need to use actual stones, though. Again, we've got a lot of synthetic materials, and in the Netherlands, for example, we use brick and concrete slabs mostly for our paving. So, you know, options to be synergetic, I think, in your views on these things. I think everyone generally opposes asphalt, though. It's not good for the soil. It's a very polluting material, and it's just not very pretty. Now, there's another manner of what you might call mega structures. Large factories, dry docks, shipyards, logistical hubs, factories, these sort of things. Anything bigger than your average pyramid. For some of these, traditional materials are impossible to use. Particularly if there are a lot of moving components in it, especially in dry docks, for example. A 7-story tall shipyard with a few dozen cranes, floating docks, etc. will have to be pretty much all made of steel. And also, there is no traditional architectonic design for something that size. So you'd have to have some stylistic innovation there, unless you want to make it look like a cathedral. I don't necessarily oppose that, but I'm not sure that it suits either the function of the building or is very cost effective. Now, that's one of the things that I really disagree with Gnon. He has gone so far as to argue that We should restrict architectural styles to only copy and pasting buildings that are pre-existent in the region. Now, I agree that modern architects like Rem Koolhaas should be tried for crimes against humanity, absolutely. But absolutely no innovation or being derivative of what's existed, or developing new styles based on old ones. Really? That seems somewhat pathological. Should we have stopped innovating with neo-Gothics, neoclassics? Is Bauhaus the limit? I don't know. Where do you draw the line? And really, I think there is innovation that's good. For example, Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau is development of traditional styles that's actually quite beautiful in modern times. And again, if you want to incorporate any of the luxuries of modern living, you're going to have to do some redesigning and some reconsidering for your architectonic style. So I don't think that being so rigid as to only copy pasting existing buildings is really feasible. So what I'm proposing is archeofuturism in architecture. You take from the past what works, and you take from what we've learned from technology, and you mesh that together. Traditional styles, traditional urban planning with modern materials, because modern materials are in a lot of things they're a lot better, especially when it comes to insulation. So in that sense, that's what you want to do.